Hi, everybody. Welcome back to CMN 153, and this is for our class for Tuesday, the 29th, where we are talking about the next chapter assigned, which happens to be about books. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the journal assignments as well as the final projects. And I'll go out of order and go first to the journals. This is the fourth point in the notes below that you should submit your journals to my email because that's how my grading program works best. Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu via PDF. Thank you to those of you who have already submitted in your journals. The idea behind the journals is that you would submit your journal by the class following its discussion. So in theory, journal number 1 would be due by Tuesday the 29th, though it would be lovely if you could hand it in before that, and I recommend that you might want to try to hand it in with your discussion forum response so that you can do both at the same time. And our next journal is going to be on books. The first journal, which would be today, if you're watching this on Tuesday, on the 29th, if you haven't already handed it in, would be on the internet. And it's approximately a page or so of thoughts or reflections about the text, class discussion, or class discussion forum responses, and your own personal experiences with the subject. So there are lots of different ways that you can proceed. And the one page is just a guesstimate. It should be as long or as short as you think it needs to be. Now, this will segue into the final project in that you will see in our section at the top of our Moodle site, the general information section, there is a folder that's entitled Syllabus and Other Documents folder. And this is where I'm posting all of the handouts that I would give in a face-to-face class. So thus far, what's been in there has been the syllabus and the course outline. But I've also just posted some information about the final project, which I wanted to talk about today. And that final project is going to be due on or before the last day of class. So you have the entire semester to work on it, and certainly you couldn't work on it after the semester. And I suspect that what will happen is over the course of the semester, you might find something that captures your attention, and that might be where you might want to focus your efforts for a final project. But the topic is very open-ended, that basically the course project for most students is a written critical analysis of the relationship between media and popular culture. But that said, this is a media class, so I will ultimately accept media that examines media. So feel free to suggest other creative approaches for your analysis. So if you think that you can utilize media to examine media, usually what that means is that it's going to require some preparation time. Perhaps you might want to do a short film. If that's the case, I would begin sooner rather than later, especially with a class that is as condensed as this one. Perhaps you might want to do something like create a short story. And I've had students do that in the past, but I ask that they also submit in written commentary about what they're doing in that story and how it relates to the topics that we are examining. Perhaps you want to put together some sort of visual presentation. And again, you would probably want to have some commentary accompanying that, talking a little bit about the decisions you made and why. So, most of you, I suspect, would be writing your traditional paper. So, written course projects, I would say approximately 4 to 5 pages in length, but as long or short as you think it needs to be to support your particular thesis, the main point. And what I've done is I've created some very general topics, but those are so general that you really need to work on getting something that's specific, and that's done deliberately. And that specific thing will be your thesis. And these are only suggestions of topics. Feel free to adapt, combine, dismiss. And I think it makes sense that you talk about your topic with me before you begin. So reaching out to me, whether it's in a discussion forum or an email or a Moodle meeting, I think is a very wise choice. If you are quoting from a text, you should be using what we call the MLA, which is Modern Language Association, System of Parenthetical Documentation. I'm hopeful this is something that you learned in your English 101 class, and I can say that we will review it briefly in this class, but it's one of the reasons why Composition 1, which we call English 101 at GCC, is a prerequisite for this course, that you've already had some experience with quoting. Basically, what the MLA system does is immediately following a quote, it indicates some of the information necessary to find that quote, and that information would be included in a parentheses following the quote. But as I said, we'll talk about this a little bit more. The syllabus talks a little bit about paper formatting specifications, which means that the paper should be typed and double spaced with 1-inch margins and so forth, with a cover page, a separate sheet of paper that lists some content information like your name and my name and the title. And again, we'll talk about this a little bit more as we get a little bit closer to the final project due date. So possible topics, and again, these are just ideas. Perhaps you want to examine something specifically focusing on media. Perhaps you want to focus on a particular media such as music video or documentary film or video game, and discuss the message or messages it gives to and about our culture. Or perhaps you want to focus on culture, some sort of a cultural group, teens, women, healthcare providers, etc., and how they are presented in the media. Perhaps you want to focus on advertising, which is really the glue that holds all media together. Focus on how the advertising for a particular product, let's say cars or toys or medication, how that advertising is presented in the media. And Jean Kilbourne did a little bit about that, about how ads are basically giving lots of messages, particularly in regards to gender. And she obviously picked and chose the ads that would help support her thesis. So one of the reasons why I wanted you to see that documentary is to see how scholars in the media field can go about putting together arguments. Now, that said, I don't expect you to do a project that is as developed as something like Jean Kilbourne's project. She spent a lifetime researching and developing that. But it gives you a sense of how you can take something that's not academic and yet examine it from an academic perspective. In her instance, advertisements. Or how about artificial intelligence? Examine the impact that artificial intelligence has and will have, perhaps, in the media and or culture. So some ways to think about this is to remember that you are analyzing more than just words. You're analyzing images and audio, all that correspond to the topic you've chosen. And if you've ever heard of the 5 W's of journalism, and we'll have a whole section devoted to journalism, then you know about who, what, when, where, and why. And we oftentimes add how and to that mix, even though how doesn't start with a W. These are wonderful questions to ask yourself when you are examining a piece of media. Who? Who is the intended audience of this message? And who produced this message? And how is that important for our understanding the message? What? What is the intended and the unintended message or messages given to the audience? When? Identify when these messages are delivered to the audience. Where? Identify where these messages are shown to the audience. How? Identify how these messages are presented to the audience and why. Identify why these messages have cultural impact in our society. And you remember we began with the first opening readings talking about media research. And again, it's a complex subject, but it gives you a little bit of a taste of how you could go about analyzing a piece of media. In other words, what lens you want to use to examine that piece of media. But regardless of what you do, you want to make sure that you evaluate the significance of your findings. Now, it's very early on in the semester, but we are also a very condensed class, being a summer class. So the sooner you begin thinking about this, the better off you are. Perhaps you already have an idea, and as I said, as soon as you get ideas, feel free to run them by me. Perhaps an idea will occur to you as we continue on with our discussions. But what I did after talking about the internet, which basically we talked about media convergence and how basically the internet has basically absorbed all other kinds of media, I'm trying to move in some sort of a chronological order talking about media. And that means that we would be talking about books, one of the oldest forms of mass media, though I guess you could argue that music is older than books, but recorded music certainly isn't older than books. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that books are the oldest mass medium. And the textbook gives you a little bit of information of their history. I also have a video that I would like you to see that talks a bit about their history, which you can see in the notes below. This is in the second section of the notes where it says, watch a video on books, the world of the book from tablet to codex and beyond, the history of the book. This is from the State Library of Victoria. It was created in 2020 and it's 8 minutes long. It'll give you some nice visuals for part of what the text and I are going to be talking about in terms of books. Beginning with papyrus and Babylonian clay tablets. We're talking about 2400 BC. And then parchment, which is treated animal skin, vellum being fine calf skin. And then in the 4th century, the Roman Codex, which was a revolution, the idea that parchment sheets could be sewn together with leather and wrapped around with some sort of a cover, usually wood, which allowed you, as the video will discuss, to have a certain level of portability and accessibility with a book that you just couldn't do with scrolls, for instance. From the year 400 to about 1500 is where we have medieval manuscripts. These were books that were printed and illustrated by hand. Very laborious, very time consuming, oftentimes done by the clergy because they were usually literate in the way that the general populace wasn't. And they are works of art if you've ever seen some of these illuminated manuscripts. Now, Chinese block printing helped to bring about the idea that paper could be applied to inked wood, and then you could basically create a copy or multiple copies. But it was really until we got to 1450 Germany and the Gutenberg printing press that changed everything with movable type on parchment, which allowed basically the beginnings of mass production of books. The Gutenberg Bible, which you might have heard of before, is the earliest mass-produced book using movable type. You may have heard of Chaucer and his Canterbury Tales from medieval literature classes, 1476. It was the first work in England that was printed in book form. Little piece of trivia there, if you like trivia. But it really wasn't until the 1800s where we get the idea of paperback books that make books much more accessible to the masses, and they were machine made with paper and cloth covers, leading to cost reductions and mass production. And that, coupled with a rising middle class because of the Industrial Revolution, really changed the idea of what a book could be. No longer did readers have to rely on experts to translate what was in a book. They could read the book themselves. And this also helped to bring about increased literacy rates because people didn't want to rely on someone else's translation. In the 1800s also is when publishing houses began seeing that books could become an industry. These were companies that produced books, and books differentiated. There are trade books that are for general readers. There are professional books for specific occupations. There are textbooks, which you are well familiar with, for devoted to students. There are religious books. The Bible, in all of its versions, is the best-selling book of all time. So that's another piece of trivia for you. There are comic books and graphic novels. And in fact, Interestingly, in the 1950s, the Comic Magazine Association of America instituted some self-censorship. There was a lot of controversy that comic books were too lurid. There were lots of horror comic books out at the time. So rather than having censorship imposed upon them, what they ended up doing was imposing self-censorship. And university press, if you've ever seen a book published by a university press, it's probably a scholarly book that's written and directed towards professionals in a very specialized field. And talking about media convergence, even before the internet, we saw how books could be turned into film and TV and ebooks and audiobooks, and how popular culture can help to promote books so that we don't have to rely on publishing houses. So Oprah Winfrey, particularly in the 1990s, her book club did a great deal to help promote or not promote book sales, depending on which book she publicized and endorsed. Now we've got Book Talk, which is doing something similar. It's an offspring of TikTok. And in terms of retail, we've moved from superstores, I should say, and Barnes and Noble's probably the superstar of them all, to independent booksellers, and of course Amazon. And Amazon began as a bookseller, and then they expanded to where they are now, which is selling just about everything. So an interesting fact about, of all places, Argentina, Buenos Aires to be exact, there are no book sales taxes that are instituted on books. So they have fixed pricing, and it's oftentimes thought that that has led to the fact that Buenos Aires has more bookstores per capita than any other city. Now, of course, there's probably many variables associated with that, but that would seem to be a major variable. One of the things that I've always loved, that I've always shared with students when I talk about books, is about a custom in Iceland where they exchange books on Christmas Eve, and the holiday season basically begins with a free household distribution of a catalog of newly published books. How beautiful is that? And you spend Christmas Eve reading a book and eating chocolate, which in my mind is heaven, but I don't know if that's your heaven. Now, books can be incredibly controversial. Think about the fact that American slaves were forbidden from reading and writing because of the power of the written word. And I wanted to read you a quote that I discuss in my Women in Literature class. And it's an essay. I think I might have actually mentioned this before, The Cult of True Womanhood. And it talks a little bit about how women were depicted in magazines and popular media in the 1800s. And it also talks about, in many ways, the fears that the written word would in one way or another lead to gender revolution. This is the quote. Quote, "The female was dangerously addicted to novel, according to the literature of the period. She should avoid them, since they interfered with, quote, serious piety, unquote. And if she simply couldn't help herself and read them anyway, she should choose edifying ones from the lists of morally acceptable authors. And the 19th century knew that girls could be ruined by a book. Books which attacked or seemed to attack women's accepted place were regarded as dangerous." So, you may be familiar with the science fiction author Ray Bradbury. In 1953, he wrote an incredibly powerful and important text called Fahrenheit 451, where basically it's a society that's filled with censorship. And firemen at the time don't put out fires, they start fires to basically burn books. And this is a future set dystopian novel where books are burned because ultimately books are illegal because of the dangers that books can present. And this is a quote from that text, Fahrenheit 451. Quote, "A book is a loaded gun in the house next door," unquote. So there have been lots of questions about censorship over the whole history of books, but especially in the last several years. If you want to think about book preservation, this started in the early days of the internet with Project Gutenberg to try to digitize books. Now we've got something called the Internet Archive, which I highly recommend because they are saving all kinds of cultural artifacts, books and movies and other kinds of media. But these book challenges that I was referencing that have been occurring recently are directly related to the US culture wars and politicizing the idea of what books should or should not be read. And it has led to some rather intense debate and scrutiny. As the old adage goes, history is told by the victor, and that is indeed true. And the idea of not being able to read, remember that I'm by training an English professor, just horrifies me. I can't imagine censoring anything. That's the only way that you're going to learn about different viewpoints. You don't have to accept those viewpoints, but it really is the only way that you can understand other viewpoints. And as we talked about the bubble that the internet has created, where individuals are basically interacting with media and other individuals who reinforce their values, it just leads to a very narrow view of the world. So there is an essay from the New York Times, actually, that I talk about in my literature class, Your Brain on Books. And it talks about, from a physiological perspective, through MRI scans, what happens when the process of reading. And it seems that our brain makes very little distinction between reading about something and actually engaging in the activity. So, for instance, if you're reading about something having a scent, then the area of your brain associated with scent is activated. If you're reading about something that is related to movement, the area of your brain associated with movement is activated. So much so that if you're reading about a movement on the right side, it's the area of the brain that's associated with right movements. What does this mean? And scholars have talked about the idea that reading is an incredibly rich replica of lived experience. And that, well, we certainly don't have the ability or the opportunity or the time to live other people's experiences. The closest perhaps we can come is through reading. And in fact, many studies have shown that empathy increases through reading because you begin to understand other people's perspectives. So perhaps that's my plug for reading. But today's attendance question is going to be specifically related to books because, as we talked about with the internet section, it really changed the media landscape. And ironically, and this is a quote that's directly from our textbook, and this is on page 279, quote, compared with other media industries, book publishing has adapted relatively smoothly to the digital turn and has been able to avoid the huge declines in revenues that we will be talking about with other forms of media, which I find fascinating. And certainly we've seen the decline of book superstores, though they are reinventing themselves as places where you can engage in community, which is something that I believe our society sorely needs. And certainly independents are beginning to come back as well, though if you're familiar with Greenfield, we just recently lost the World Eye bookstore. Again, it's so difficult to be competitive in this economic market, as particularly with online sales. But yet the book industry has seemed to do so in a way that many other industries haven't. So my question to you, for which there is no right or wrong answer, but I'm curious to know your thoughts. Why do you think that's the case? And again, there's probably lots of different variables that all intersect with one another, but it's certainly something to think about when we think about the economics of media as the semester progresses, that somehow the book industry has been more resilient than many of the other media industries. We'll talk about music recording, for instance, in face of the digital revolution. So that attendance question will be due by Thursday, the 31st. And certainly, again, if you need additional time, please let me know. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are encouraged to, much like you would in a face-to-face class situation. If somebody made a comment that you thought was somewhat interesting, you might make a comment in turn, but you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn, and that'll give you a good idea of what we might have talked about in a class discussion. All of these things in our discussion forums are things that you could utilize in your journals, or perhaps might even spur an idea for you for a final project. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class. And I recommend that you, and I had mentioned this earlier, that any of the documents in the syllabus and other documents folder that you make a hard copy of. So I just reviewed the final project document that I have uploaded into our syllabus and other documents folder. So I recommend that you make a hard copy of it just so that it's easily accessible to you, so you can reference it as you're thinking about final projects. There are also questions at the ending of the textbook chapters that perhaps might motivate you to come up with a particular idea. Again, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.